Hi there, folks. Welcome to another exciting edition of Israel Explained. I'm your host, Ben-Ephraim, and let's get down to business. So, today the ICJ issued its interim rulings, um, and that's led to a great conversation on whether Israel has won or lost this, whether it should have engaged with the court at all, and of course, what this means for the future. So, as you remember, South Africa brought Israel to the International Court of Justice in The Hague on charges that it is violating the Genocide Convention. Um, the actual judgment on whether Israel is guilty of doing so will take a long time, probably a few years, maybe around three. But much earlier than that, a couple weeks after the initial charges were filed and discussed, it issues its interim rulings where it can decide on several measures. Also, at that point, it determines whether or not it has the competence to deal with the case, which of course the ICJ today ruled that it had. And it also came up with several interim steps that Israel is supposed to follow, but not the ones that Israel was most concerned about, which is why we have a sort of complicated outcome here from Israel's perspective. So we did not expect the ICJ to reject the claim of genocide out of hand and say that it doesn't have competence to rule this. That would have been very surprising. And indeed, the Chief Justice said, quote, in the court's view, at least some of the acts and omissions committed by Israel in Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. But the ruling was also very careful to say that at this point, the court does not have to and has not decided whether Israel is performing genocide or not. And the fact that at no point in the judgment did it call on Israel to desist from acting in contravention to the Genocide Convention is a good sign. Instead, it called on Israel to avoid doing it in the future, showing that they have no assumption that Israel is already violating the Genocide Convention. One of the main forms of um, evidence regarding the plausibility of Israel committing genocide according to the convention were several quotes from Israeli ministers. Not all the quotes that South Africa brought were mentioned by the ICJ judges, but some of them were. Wisely, they focused on those of individuals who have a lot of um, say in shaping the war effort, like Yoav Gallant, for example, Israel Katz, who is now the foreign minister, at the time was the energy minister, and President Isaac Herzog, who may not have much of a role in shaping the conflict, but is the head of state, at least officially, and therefore his words are relevant. That is a reminder that our politicians, Israeli politicians, need to shut up and not say anything that will contribute to any of this, because it seems that the court was more struck by that than any other quote unquote evidence that Israel is committing genocide. Of course, there is none. But the fact that Israel is saying things that could be interpreted as an intention of carrying out genocide is one of the main reasons the ICJ could entertain this to begin with. So that's something that we've been warning about for a while, and it's something that Israeli politicians need to heed very carefully. I'm sure some of them, like Yoav Gallant, will, but others on the right will not heed this despite the problem. So, what did the court actually say that Israel should do? Well, first, and this Israel expected, the court said that Israel should void anything that could be a genocidal act or is in contravention to the Genocide Convention. Israel argues that it's already doing that. I would say that Israel is indeed already doing that. But of course, now the ICJ will be watching, so Israel needs to be more careful in that regard. It also said that Israeli politicians should avoid incitement, which is something that Israel has not done enough, and that Israel should punish people who are inciting to genocide, which I agree with. It also noted that the Israeli Attorney General said that she is willing to recommend prosecuting individuals who are inciting against genocide, and mentioned that approvingly, showing again that the robust independence of the Israeli judicial system is protecting Israel from international courts, and therefore is something that we need to encourage. Well, that, and also in order to protect Israeli democracy. But here you have another reason to do that. Israel must avoid the destruction of possible evidence in the case, which is something that hopefully Israel is already doing. It certainly doesn't look good if Israel is destroying evidence to try to make itself look good in court. Instead, it should be acting in a way that um, does not contravene the Genocide Convention. Israel must also present a report in a month to explain how it is fulfilling these various orders, which I'm sure that it will do, and that will also encourage Israel to be careful in this regard over that month, and hopefully after that month. And the ICJ said that Israel should be allowing any humanitarian aid, something that it definitely has been doing. Recently, the amount of aid trucks coming into Gaza has been 200 trucks or so, which is, at least theoretically, enough to meet the needs of the population. Of course, most of it is going to Hamas, and that is to a great extent because Israel is not making sure to control the distribution points, which I say is a big mistake. But also, in the last 3 days, demonstrators in Kerem Shalom crossing have been blocking the entrance of aid. And of course, if that continues, that is something the ICJ will address and will look at as a violation of the order that it has issued, making it all the more important that Israel not allow demonstrators to hold it hostage and prevent it from fulfilling the policy that it has agreed to and that it's agreed to with the United States. So all of those things are elements that Israel was prepared for. All of those measures were measures that Israel expected the ICJ to rule. They're all common sense measures, to be honest. The thing that Israel was most concerned about was that the court would order a cessation to the fighting, which it had done in the Russian-Ukrainian case. In the Russian-Ukrainian case, the ICJ believed that there was enough evidence that Russia was committing war crimes and intending to commit genocide that they should stop fighting right away. Meanwhile, in the Israeli case, they did not. And that's something to think about when we accuse the ICJ of being anti Semitic or particularly anti Israel. They ordered something in the Russian case they did not in the Israeli case. Rightfully so. Absolutely rightfully so. The Russians are committing war crimes regularly. And there was also a history of them committing horrible war crimes in Syria and Chechnya before that. But it shows the court does weigh actual evidence in determining this and doesn't just decide willy-nilly that Israel is to blame for everything. Um, so this is not an absolute victory by any means. The case will continue. That's a PR problem because over the next 3 years at least, Israel is going to be linked with genocide in an official court. So the fact that I am satisfied with the interim measures that the ICJ has issued doesn't mean that this is all good news for Israel. The fact that this was not thrown out by the ICJ is certainly bad for Israeli PR, and Israeli government would wish that it had done so. But there is a possible upside if after 3 years Israel is found not to have committed genocide, which is certainly possible considering that it appears that Israel is getting a relatively fair hearing. That will be a great PR victory, something to wave against people who accuse Israel of genocide. Israel will have been found innocent of those charges. It may not seem so right now, but if that happens, the whole exercise might actually be worth it and be a great victory for Israel in the long term. Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Who knows what the court will find? The court may already uh, based on evidence now, find Israel guilty of genocide, which would be wrong, in my opinion. Or Israel could, in the future, commit actions that the ICJ believes to be genocide. So I'm not saying that Israel will win, but a long-term victory may actually mean that it was good for Israel that this went to the court. Now, important to remember that this decision is symbolic in the sense that the ICJ really can't um, really can't enforce it. And also, even the interim measures that the ICJ has ordered wouldn't require any change to Israeli strategy. Israel is already letting in humanitarian aid. Israel is already not committing genocide and hopefully not destroying evidence. So all of these things that it's being asked to do are things Israel is doing already, and Israel should continue to do, regardless of what the ICJ says. But despite the fact that this has been a generally good decision for Israel, you wouldn't know it from the way the PR is being handled. Hamas in South Africa immediately came out and congratulated the court, even though they are not necessarily happy with the outcome. They hope that the ICJ would force Israel to stop the fighting, especially Hamas was counting on that now to strengthen it in its negotiations to end the war. But they still congratulated the ICJ and said that this was a great ruling, which is a smart PR move. Here's an example. South Africa called it, quote, a decisive victory for the international rule of law and a significant milestone in the search for justice for the Palestinian people. Uh, end quote. That makes any casual observer think that Israel has lost. That quote, in combination with some of the headlines saying that the court didn't reject it, together create a um, clickable moment, and most people don't click on articles, to show that Israel didn't get what it wanted. And Netanyahu really didn't help with that sense. He called the decision, even to discuss the possibility of genocide, outrageous. Here's the full quote from him. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right, he means to defend itself, is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. But just the fact that it was discussed is not only false, it's outrageous. And decent people everywhere should reject it. So the sense of outrage in Netanyahu's cadence makes it sound like Israel lost here, and that means that it's guilty of genocide. The Hamas and South African PR approach is much smarter. It doesn't matter all that much what it says in the ruling if you frame it correctly. And Israel's framing it as a defeat, and I'm not sure why. Maybe in order to rally the base at home against the anti-Semites abroad. It's not helpful on the international public relations level. And it's very understandable why the ICJ ruled what they did. I'm sure some people will get angry at me for saying this, but from the ICJ's perspective, their role is not to protect Israeli interests for self-defense, which, by the way, it did do by not forcing Israel or ruling that Israel should stop the operation. Its main goal is to make sure that the Genocide Convention is observed. That's their main goal in this hearing. Therefore, they will err on the side of making sure that Israel does not commit acts that may be interpreted as genocide, rather than erring on the side of Israeli self-defense. And think about why. Let's say the ICJ ruled that um, they had no competence over this case, and Israel was not committing genocide, threw it all out of court. That would have been justifiable based on the level of evidence. But what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that if later Israel escalates and does things that are a violation of humanitarian law, or even, and I don't believe this would actually happen, flirting with genocide, people could rightfully say to the ICJ, you didn't protect the Palestinian people. You let Israel off the hook immediately without even discussing the case on merits. Therefore, the blood of people in Gaza is on your hands. That's a situation that a judge sworn to uphold the convention. That's their job in this particular motion. It's a position they don't want to be in. So I fully understand why the ICJ made the decision that they made, although it's not necessarily right, and I don't necessarily agree with it. So what does this mean for the rest of the war? Well, technically, like I said, not all that much, because Israel is already, I believe, fulfilling the orders that the ICJ gave. And like I said, the ICJ can't enforce any of these decisions. They are legally binding, technically, but there's no way to enforce them on on the field of battle. But this might change the way Israel acts. The more Israel self-enforces these interim decisions, the better the odds that a final judgment will be in Israel's favor. What Israel does and the outcome are now strongly linked. If Israel fulfills these interim measures, it will be very hard for the ICJ to claim that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. On a strategic level, I think, and I say this with a lot of regret, this makes an invasion of Rafah less likely. I've already talked several times about why an invasion of Rafah is essential for an Israeli victory. And with over 1 million people there, most of them refugees, and Israel under the ICJ microscope, it makes it more difficult than ever before for Israel to do that. I'm not saying they won't, but this makes it a lot more difficult. And it underscores the time Israel should have gone a long time ago. It's made a major mistake by waiting this long. The ICJ is now a serious problem with that. Egypt has become a serious problem with that. And perhaps if Israel had done this earlier, when international public opinion was more on its side, would have been able to complete that essential part of the invasion. No point in crying over spilled milk. I still think Israel should go into Rafah, but this makes it harder. Another consequence. Unfortunately, Israel's legal troubles are not going to stop here. The ICJ is a body that has the competence to make rulings over states, but its sister court, sitting in The Hague, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has jurisdiction over individuals. And human rights organizations have been collecting the names of IDF officers in order to deliver them to the ICC. What they'll likely do is find some officers there's the most evidence against who may have genuinely committed war crimes or who they at least have some evidence, maybe not real evidence, maybe not convincing evidence, and they will forward that to the ICC. Expect to see Israeli officers before the ICC. I think that Israel should respond by taking some Hamas commanders to the ICC. Israel has a stronger case against them than anyone has a case against IDF officers who generally operate according to international law. Now, the outcome of this shows the importance of engaging with international bodies. There is an illusion pro-Israeli people have, especially on the right, that if we don't engage with international institutions, that means that we show that they're not legitimate. The truth is, no one cares if Israel thinks that the courts are legitimate or not. All that happens if Israel doesn't go to the courts and says that they're not legitimate is it makes Israel look like a rogue state. It makes Israel look like a pariah state. It doesn't reflect badly on the courts. You're not going to be able to delegitimize the ICJ. The ICJ has existed in various forms since 1922. First, it was called the PCIJ. Now it's called the ICJ. So first it was the Court for the League of Nations, and that was inherited by the UN. It's been there since 1922. All 193 member states of the UN are parties to the ICJ automatically by being members of the UN. It is veteran and respected. There is nothing that Israel can do to delegitimize the ICJ. All it can do is delegitimize itself by not engaging. And all it can do is make sure it does not get a fair hearing by not presenting the evidence. When Israel was at the ICJ over the issue of the security wall in the West Bank, Israel didn't present any evidence, and it lost the case. Now, granted, it probably would have lost the case either way. Uh, that was more cut and dry than this genocide case, but perhaps the ruling could have been less damaging. And in this case, we see with the interim rulings, they're a lot less damaging than they could have been if Israel had not defended itself, and defended itself very well, I might add. Even if Israel loses in the end, the fact that it managed to avoid the interim ruling calling on it to stop fighting was worth the effort Israel put in. It's kind of like if you get a summons to traffic court and you don't show up. The fact that you didn't show up does not invalidate traffic court. It just means that you will definitely have to pay the fine. There's no point in pretending that international law and international courts don't exist. They do. That's just fighting against reality. Okay, now let's answer some questions. Harry asks, the differentiation of smart bombs and dumb bombs in the context of Operation Swords of Iron is by itself relatively meaningless. A couple of things to consider. The first is the Israeli Air Force flies F-15s and F-16s, both very accurate dumb bombers that use the constantly computed impact point. So is there really a difference between the weight of bombs? Don't you get killed if you're in the building anyways? Also, I have heard military experts speak on this, that unguided missiles are meaningless when used with F-15s. Okay, so two things on this, Harry. One, you're not exactly right that it doesn't matter if you're using an F-15 or F-16 if a bomb is dumb or smart. In fact, there have been cases with F-15s and F-16s where Israel has taken out one apartment in a building and everyone else in the building survived. Or Israel, using fighter jets, has taken out one car in the street and everyone else in nearby cars survived. Another thing to consider is that Israel does an increasing amount of its targeted assassinations now by drone. And drones are even more accurate than these fighter jets with smart bombs. And then sometimes Israel will use intentionally dumb bombs when it's trying to take out entire buildings that could be used as cover for Hamas forces, but doesn't know exactly where they are. So they're trying to soften up targets so that infantry can go in. So it's not that you're right that the dumb bombs, quote unquote, can be quite smart from F-15s, F-16s, but smart bombs can be even smarter. And sometimes you want to use dumb bombs intentionally. So there is a difference, and that's exactly the kind of thing that the court might look at more in the ICC than the ICJ, because the ICJ is talking about genocide, but the ICC can talk about war crimes. So these things matter on a legal level, matters on a moral level, because Israel should not ever kill innocent Palestinians when it can prevent that. If it's collateral damage, it's highly regrettable, should be prevented at all costs. Sonny LeBouf asks, although it still seems to want confrontation, Iran has clearly called on its proxies to increase their provocations in the last couple of weeks. Is this just another step on the ladder of a broader escalation, or is it more directly connected to events in Gaza? That is to say, the axis of resistance stepping up its war effort because they genuinely fear the collapse of Hamas rule and want to increase pressure on Israel, or is it just that they feel more and more emboldened to escalate? So the answer to that is a yes to everything that you said. Hamas is valuable to Iran. There is a genuine fear in Iran that they're going to lose their proxy. I'm sure they're very happy to see that Israel is not cooperating with the Saudi American initiative for a day after. I'm sure they're very happy to see that Israel is falling into a sort of quagmire in Gaza and allowing Hamas to regroup. But Israel can still accept that plan. Israel can still escalate and defeat Hamas. So they're very concerned about that. And all the other elements that they're putting into play here in with the Houthis, Hezbollah, are in order to distract Israel from that. But also, while Iran is getting pushed back against by the United States and by Israel, they're not being pushed back against enough. The price that Iran is paying is not all that high. There's been some assassinations, there's been some attacks. It looks like Israel has been cooperating with opposition forces in Iran, so is the US, causing more damage to Iran than we think, but not enough. Iran feels that what they're gaining is outweighing what they're losing by escalating. So both things are right. FRDZ4KB asks, if the potential deal of 1 month, maybe even two, for a ceasefire materializes, do you think Israel would really be able to restart the war in Gaza? Or wouldn't that basically morph into a permanent one? Keeping troops in readiness, international political pressure, and maybe even domestic opinion. That all seems to make it pretty unlikely, no? Well, a couple things on that. First, that whole report that there's going to be a 1 to 2 month ceasefire and Israel's going to get back the hostages is apparently very incorrect. Hamas is not going to agree to that kind of thing. Hamas wants an end to the war, in exchange for the hostages. I don't believe any of the reports saying that they're willing to agree to anything less. Everyone I'm talking to, everything I'm seeing indicates that Hamas wants to release the hostages in exchange for an end to the war. And honestly, they'd have to be insane not to have that position. That's their one element of leverage, and it even seems to be working. Israel is actually talking to them um, about these sorts of things. If Israel was going to stop for a month or two, it probably could restart because it did it last time. And that's exactly why Hamas would never agree to it. What they want is not only for Israel to stop permanently, but also international guarantees from the United States and other trustworthy countries that the war will not restart. Otherwise, it won't stop. So because Israel could restart, that's not going to happen, in my opinion. I hope it does. I hope I'm wrong. It would be great if Israel could get the hostages back and then renew, but I don't see that happening. But not for the reasons that you're saying, because Hamas would never agree to that. Okay, thank you for joining me again. If you like what I do here, considering supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. That's Shael Media. I'm completing an episode of the History of the Land of Israel podcast on the era of the Book of Judges. So that will be out in a day or two. And I will see you here again on Israel Explored.